Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Hidden History. You know, normally when you think about Richard Nixon, you probably think of him as a crook and not really someone who is so much of a good guy. Because really, of that Watergate scandal, him breaking into that Democratic office and then trying to cover it up and all those lies and those scandals, well, what if I told you he did something much, much worse? Well, he did. Today we'll take you through the little-known story of how, in the run-up to the 1968 election, Richard Nixon, with his back up against the wall, and Lyndon Johnson furiously trying to save his campaign and end the Vietnam War, how Richard Nixon used a secret woman, in fact, on the inside of the South Vietnamese government to sabotage the peace talks, causing millions of Americans' lives and more years of awful, awful war. A really kind of unknown situation that was really just revealed as recently as 2007, and really has, in terms of the broad popular culture and recognition of Nixon, you know, it is kind of insane that he is so much more known for this very much kind of Washington intrigue story where, you know, like it or not, the biggest thing that happened was, you know, some documents and information was stolen, whereas, you know, this is a crime that has cost, you know, demonstrably millions and millions of lives. Both on the American side and especially on the Vietnamese side. So I'll take you into this here with John A. Farrell, writing here in the history department for Political Magazine. He's the author of Richard Nixon, The Life. Richard Nixon's telephone calls came regularly during the 1968 campaign, and H.R. Haldeman, the chief of staff of Nixon eventually, took meticulous notes, jotting down the instructions he received from the candidate. Sometimes Nixon needed to blow off steam, demanding that a reporter from the Washington Post or the Times be banned from his campaign airplane for writing an offending story. Times and Post off, Haldeman recorded. Times forever. One such call came at midnight from Nixon's co-op apartment on Fifth Avenue. Haldeman duly noted that the stirring score to the World War II documentary Victory at Sea, which Nixon so enjoyed, was playing on a phonograph in the background. Other calls were steeped in intrigue. In one series of scribbles, Haldeman reported Henry Kissinger's willingness to inform on his U.S. diplomatic colleagues and keep Nixon updated on President Lyndon Johnson's furious 11th-hour efforts to end the Vietnam War. So at this point, Henry Kissinger who was at the time an American diplomat, who was very much well-informed on what was going on, and he realized that, you know, largely for political reasons and for, you know, because he knew the war wasn't really going to go anywhere, Lyndon Johnson, ahead of his 1968 re-election, was frantically trying to end the war. He knew if he didn't come up with the war, I mean, there was pretty much no point in him running for a second term. So Haldeman was Nixon's campaign chief of staff. He was a devoted political adjutant since the 1950s. In November 1968, the two men connected on what became known as the Chanot Affair. Nixon gave Haldeman his orders: find ways to sabotage Johnson's plans to stage productive peace talks so that a frustrated American electorate would turn to the Republicans as their only hope to end the war. Their gambit worked, and the Chanot Affair, named for Anna Chanot, the Republican doyen and fundraiser who became Nixon's backchannel to the South Vietnamese government, lingered as a diplomatic and political whodunit for decades. Johnson and his aides suspected his treachery at the time. Poor Americans were eavesdropping on their South Vietnamese allies. You know, when have we not ever resisted the temptation to eavesdrop on anyone? I mean, our presidents up until Nixon obviously taped all their conversations in the White House. So yeah, they were pretty much hesitated. You know, really the most remarkable thing about this is here they hesitated to really go in on it because they thought, you know, with all the intense, incredible kind of social and political ferment of the 1960s, that it just would have been too much. Like, if we had went out and accused a member of the Republican Party of just, you know, trying to keep American troops in the war for longer, just for his own political, you know, benefit. You know, he apparently told them, the South Vietnamese at the time, saying, you know, we can get a better deal. You know, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I don't know if that's a very, you know, good Nixon there. Nixon, yeah, he's just steadfastly denied involvement up until his death, while lawyers fended off efforts to obtain campaign records from the 1968 campaign. It wasn't until after 2007, when the Nixon Presidential Library finally opened up Haldeman's notes to the public, that The biographer here stumbled upon a smoking gun in the course of conducting research for his biography of Nixon. 4 pages of notes, his brush-cut aided scrawled late on one October evening in 1968. Keep Anna should know working on SVN. South Vietnamese, Haldeman wrote, as Nixon barked orders in the phone. They were out to monkey wrench Johnson's election eve initiative, and it worked. So the following account of the Chanel affair is the most up-to-date and revealing of Nixon's intrigue, the product of hours of archival research, open records, requests, and a little luck. Documenting the cynical maneuvers is important for history's sake, but the fact that it took nearly 50 years for Nixon's secret to emerge offers vital lesson for today. It shows how hard it is to find definitive proof of collaboration with foreign power. This is to be about, President Donald Trump and, yada, yada, yada about Russia. But we're interested in the history part here. So he writes, Nixon was especially anxious on the night of October 22nd, 1968. He had entered the fall campaign with formidable lead over VP Hubert Humphrey, but the polls were narrowing as working-class Democrats were turned to the party. So it was a very kind of an interesting situation here. October 22nd, 1968. So pretty much it was a very contentious campaign on the Democratic side after it was finally announced that at this point, run up to 1968 election, it was pretty clear that, A, Johnson wouldn't run for a second term, and B, the absolute brawl that Democrats had over the complete kind of fracturing their coalition, this wedge driven in between this, on one side, a young kind of student movement kind of class of people who really were ready to burn it down and, in an attempt to stop the war in the 1968 convention. Then the compromise was made. Humphrey was put in place as this kind of like, real representation of the old kind of establishment coalition of the Democrats who were deeply tied to the labor movement, but did not think of themselves first as workers, but thought of themselves first as homeowners. Hubert Humphrey, he was polling in as the working class Democrats returned to the party, and Johnson's efforts to make peace made news. Nixon believed he would prevail unless a major event reset the political topography, and he knew Johnson knew that too, as did the Soviet Union. So Kremlin leaders had never much liked the red-baiting anti-communist Nixon. To keep him from the Oval Office and help Humphrey become president, they were meddling in the U.S. presidential campaign and pressing their clients in North Vietnam to agree to a ceasefire and hold constructive talks to end the war. According to Haldeman's notes, Kissinger alerted the Nixon campaign late September and early in October that something was up. So Kissinger at this time was kind of their man on the inside. So here, they were pretty much coming to the realization that, it really looked like from both sides that to come up to, kind of come together to stop Nixon, that the Soviets and LBJ, who had that one kind of common interest, would come together to try to stop the Vietnam War, at least, significantly many years early. 7 years of just complete death could have been avoided here, which is kind of incredible. So according to Haldeman's notes, they alerted him that something was up. Nixon had no influence in Moscow or Hanoi, but he was not completely vulnerable to the events. He had that pipeline to Saigon, where South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu and his associates feared that LBJ was selling them out. If Thieu would drag his feet and stall the proposed peace talks, Nixon can portray Johnson's failed peace initiative as a desperate political trick, but to do so, Nixon had to get the word to Thieu and tell him to stand firm. Nixon's main conduit was Chennault, the Chinese-American widow of Claire Chennault, the American aviator who led the squadrons of Flying Tigers into battle on behalf of China against Japanese invaders during World War II. She had many friends in the palaces of South Vietnam, nationalist China, and other pro-Western countries on the Asian Rim. Nixon also told Haldeman to have Rosemary Woods, the candidate's voted secretary, and contact another member of the pro-nationalist China lobby, businessman Louis Kung, and tell him to pressure Thieu as well. She was going to get Kung to going in on the SVN and telling them to hold firm. That's what Nixon wanted Haldeman to do. So Nixon's campaign sabotage of Johnson's peace prospects was successful. 9 days later, Thieu's decision to boycott the talks headlined the New York Times and other U.S. newspapers. They got him to do that key step. Pretty much reminded American voters of the long-harbored mistrust of the wheeler and dealer, LBJ, and his big credibility gap on Vietnam. And Humphrey, really his momentum faded, and Nixon won in a very kind of close race. So LBJ, he'd been wiretapping this whole time. He knew what was going on. His national security advisor, Walt Rostow, urged him to unmask Nixon's treachery. Humphrey's aides told their boss to expose the episode and disgrace their Republican foes, but Johnson and Humphrey balked. They did not have the conclusive proof that Nixon had personally directed their actions, which was something that they really needed if they were going to make such a kind of destabilizing accusation so soon. And so Nixon won the 1968 election and led America further into carnage in Southeast Asia. In the years that followed, many elements of the Chinook affair came into light, but Nixon stuck by his details and his denials that he participated in the scheme. Lack of evidence of Nixon's direct involvement gave pause to historians and offered his loyalists a platform from which to defend him on, but no longer, as Haldeman's notes, are the long-sought evidence that Nixon personally intervened to scuttle Johnson's efforts to end the war. It's now possible to reconstruct the events of October and November 1968 with the inescapable conclusion that Nixon's behavior was devious, tragic, and given the lives at stake, arguably more reprehensible than his activities in the Watergate scandal. Ladies and gentlemen, listeners of the Spencer Walsh Radio Network, happy holidays, and thank you so much for supporting us this year. We are willing to give the gift of audio to you this holiday season, and boy, will it keep coming. We have an action-packed schedule through the 17th of December to the 16th of January, and that all starts with new episodes of Newsflash Now 3 times a week on our old summer schedule of Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. In addition, Hidden History returns with 6 select episodes, 4 on Tuesdays and 2 on select Thursdays, to give you the perfect historical narrative to keep you interested through those times with the family this holiday season. It's been such a great year, and it couldn't have been as good for the Spencer Walsh Radio Network without your support. So, to another year of great audio. So, we're talking about Nixon here and Haldeman and these notes that really kind of proved this evidence. And how did Haldeman's notes, really, this is the question, escape that public scrutiny for almost 50 years? When Nixon took office in January 1969, Haldeman was awarded for his decades of service with the job of White House Chief of Staff. He had built a centralized organization that in many aspects remains the preferred model today, kind of setting the model for the first kind of real Chief of Staff White House org chart, I guess. No detail: the grocery list for the president's vacation home in Key Biscayne, the wages of the gardeners of the Western White House in San Clemente, California, the supply of toilet paper at Camp David was beyond his purview. Throughout the Nixon presidency, he spent hours in the Oval Office recording the president's instructions on matters great and small. The spring of 1972, nearing the end of Nixon's first term, Haldeman ordered a general reorganization of the White House filing system. His aides selected the most sensitive documents from the White House central files and placed them in a group that was called the White House Special Files. The Special Files were pretty much a greatest hits collection of Nixon and pretty much all the dirty things that he did. So when Nixon resigned in 1974, aides to his successor, Gerald Ford, alerted the president, Congress, and Watergate prosecutors that truckloads of Nixon's papers were being shipped to San Clemente. Ford put a stop to that process, infuriating the exiled ex-president, and Congress enacted special legislation effectively seizing the documents from those famous White House tapes that would kind of come out, proving like the smoking gun stuff and all of that. Ford generally, the biggest probably political mistake that he ever made was pardoning Nixon. He could definitely, you could tell here, through his actions that he knew it. And, as much as possible, I think his biggest goal, because, he wasn't too much of a political striver, like the ultimate guy, the only president we've ever had to never be elected as president or vice president, somebody who really, when it came down to it, just was not really quite supposed to be there and just trying to keep various groups happy. So all previous chief executives had retained control of their papers and chose to bequeath them to their heirs, sell them, or store them at a presidential library. Nixon had sound grounds to contest the government's seizure of his tapes and papers, especially those of a personal or purely political nature. He went to court, and his this is the funny thing. Yeah, he went to court, and his legal team scored victory after victory. After one favorable decision, the aide Monica Crowley, who I believe is on Fox News now, I'm not sure, later reported the elated former president sat down at the piano and banged out "Happy Days Are Here Again." Nixon, fretted with good cause about his legacy by the time of his death in 1994, he succeeded in keeping all but a few reels of the White House tapes, tens of thousands of sensitive documents from historians and biographers, but the tapes did begin to trickle out in 1996, so yeah, it was really only his death that kind of opened up the floodgates. So 700 of the 3,600 hours of conversation are still being processed today from these special files. Much of these... So yeah, these files here, they are slowly starting to trickle out. And the 1962 folders contain notes from a strategy meeting in which Nixon, Haldeman, and other top advisors pretty much are deciding, which rival candidates to, phone tap and tail and all that stuff. Long before Watergate, Nixon was fascinated with such sneakery. In yet another file in the Nixon library, I found a page, this is again the biographer talking, of reminders he had written to himself against for his first campaign in Congress against the Democratic incumbent Jerry Voorhis in 1946. Set up spies in V camp, he had scribbled. Haldeman is known as Nixon's kind of alter ego, the highest-ranked White House aide to go to prison for his Watergate-era crimes, for participating in the smoking gun conversations that incriminated Nixon, and for the meticulous Haldeman diaries, published as a best-selling book in 1994. Until the Nixon campaign taping system was installed in early 1971, Haldeman's notes and diary entries form the best, most candid record of his internal reckonings. His notes from the 1968 campaign are equally essential if you're trying to kind of understand all the kind of intense political ferment that was happening, both within the country and kind of within the right wing at the time, as Nixon really was so kind of very much obsessed and kind of making, isolating a lot of people, who in the government, for example, people with deep ties to Republican and governmental forces that go beyond and came much before Nixon. People, for example, in the State Department establishment who Henry Kissinger and Nixon really alienated by kind of basing their own foreign policy pretty much all around him. And, Nixon viewing this time as a time to really make his own foreign policy, which, he cared much more about than domestic policy. And, State Department people and other people, let's just say, not liking that very much. And then, of course, you have the 1968 campaign as well. And this is where the Southern strategy took place and the threat to unravel at the Republican National Convention in Miami, with the South delegates yearning to switch to more conservative Ronald Reagan. So this is really a kind of a moment where Nixon had been in this for a long time, kind of representing the two wings of, the more normal right, and then the kind of, it's kind of the base. Reagan represented very much the base, and then, Nixon represented someone who can kind of bring together the base with the more elite and the kind of business class people. Haldeman recorded how Nixon dispatched his campaign manager, John Mitchell, to reassure Peter O'Donnell, the Texas State Republican chairman, with a message of cool off the Southerners. They should know, Nixon said, in choosing a running mate, that he would not ram someone down your throat. They should also know that Nixon will bring peace on civil rights and lay off the pro-Negro cap, the most explicit promise that I found from a candidate who preferred to cloak his position on segregation and euphemistic talk about pushy liberal bureaucrats and the folly of court-ordered busing. Haldeman has also noted that Nixon's musings about how best deal with the third-party candidate of Alabama candidacy of Alabama Governor George Wallace, which he kind of worried about splitting the vote. So RN has emotional access to lower middle-class white, not fair to call them racist, but concerned regarding crime, violence, law, and order. Haldeman noted the Roman Catholic minorities, Irish, Italian, Pole, Mexican, were afraid of Negroes and should be targeted after the convention needs stronger end position on this operationally, must do something, Nixon said, must dry up Wallace vote. So pretty much using, pretty much all for political purposes here. We got to, hammer in on those, like law and order, like silent majority, like Negro fears, and, bringing all these kind of Roman Catholic groups under in this working class base as well. So a very, very interesting situation. So, and you also see some kind of early hints of Watergate at this time, with Nixon telling Haldeman to leak word to a friendly journalist that Humphrey and the campaign manager, Lawrence O'Brien, had potentially embarrassing ties to an eccentric defense contractor, billionaire Howard Hughes. Have learned unimpeachable source, Nixon told Haldeman, H.H. Son has been on H. Hughes' payroll, and O'Brien is financed by H. Hughes. Interesting. Howard Hughes, looking at his deep ties to, some of those same potentially anti-Nixon forces that I was mentioning earlier. In 1960, John Kennedy's campaign had effectively exploited the news of a Hughes loan to the Nixon family, raising questions of influence peddling that hounded Nixon for years. His White House files showed that his obsession with the O'Brien-Hughes relationship never waned. In 1972, O'Brien's office at the Democratic National Committee would become a target of the Watergate burglars. But the true really, again, the true morsels, the true big chunks here came from the Chenot affair and kind of confirming the Chenot affair and just, again, highlighting this incredible treachery that he frankly put up there. So, you really kind of, more than Watergate, more than anything, he really feared the disclosure of the Chenot affair. He lied right from the start to Johnson, who was trying to keep Nixon, Humphrey, and Tew on board the peace train, saying, "I would never do anything to encourage Saigon not to come to the table." Nixon telling LBJ as a conversation captured on the Johnson White House taping system. The denials continued through the years to his friend and biographer Jonathan Aitken. Nixon dismissed the Chenot canard and insisted he never participated in any such plot. In his memoir, R.N., Nixon never mentioned Chenot. To David Frost in their celebrated 1977 televised interviews, Nixon was categorical. I did nothing to undercut them, he said of the peace talks. As far as Madame Chenot or any number of other people, I did not authorize them, and I had no knowledge of any contact with Southern, blah, 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 blah. The former president had good cause to prevaricate. Nixon's actions to sabotage the peace talks were highly inappropriate, if true, as Kissinger later put it. Obviously Kissinger and Nixon working together on these. So it does seem, as Kissinger later put it, he was trying to, seeming in violation of law prohibits private citizens from trying to defeat measures of the United States or otherwise meddle in its diplomacy. Pretty much what they're doing here as candidate and not as President Nixon would be pretty, blatant treason. Blatant treason. But they should be fined under this title in prison not more than 3 years or both. So this is what you get there for trying to sabotage a possible end to a war where hundreds of thousands of Americans are dying and tons more countless Vietnamese civilians are going out. So it's the Logan Act. Was enacted by the founders to address such a situation. It was named for George Logan, who conducted a private negotiation with the French government during the administration of President John Adams. Logan, a member of the political opposition, used the notoriety to win election to the U.S. Senate. And you can kind of see why people, would not want that happening. Two different people representing the United States, very dangerous situation. But by the time Election Day had come and gone, there were far too many interests aware of Chenot's actions, or the White House, the FBI, the South Vietnamese, and the Nixon and the Humphrey campaigns to keep a lid on the scandal. So journalists Drew Pearson, Tom Otnad, Theodore Weiss, Jules Whitcover, and Seymour Hersh advanced the story bit by bit, writing over the years. But so did book writing Johnson administration officials Clark Clifford and William Bunny, and University of Virginia scholar Ken Hughes. In 2014 book, Chasing Shadows, Anna Chenot did write a memoir divulging some details, as did Bui Diem, the South Vietnamese ambassador to the United States at the time. The biggest break came when trustees at the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library decided to ignore Rostow's instructions and make public the tapes and files that LBJ had wanted sealed. The 1994 opening of the so-called X envelope, which included reports of the FBI surveillance of Chenot, and the 2008 release of the Johnson tapes from the 1968 election caused a sensation. More recently, the Nixon Presidential Library, fulfilling open records requests that I and two other scholars had made, released an oral history and two long-written reports by the Nixon White House aide Tom Houston, who had been tasked by Haldeman to collect evidence on the episode for potential use against Johnson. So in a February 25th, 1970 memo attached to an 11-page report, Houston warned Haldeman the evidence in this case did not dispel the notion that we were somehow involved in the Chenot affair, and while releasing some of this information would be most embarrassing to President Johnson, it would not be helpful to us either. What remained, though, as I started working on a biography of Nixon in 2011, again, biographer obviously writing here, was that one final and elusive and most important piece of the puzzle, the direct evidence of Nixon's involvement in the return White House special files provided that proof. So all in all, what we come down to here is looking at this situation is we're talking about 7 more years of just war, destruction, and death here for 2 more presidents. Like Gerald Ford was the one, we had the fall of Saigon and that, kind of fully ending things. But in the end, if you remember Tricky Dick for anything, a lot of people are going to remember him for Watergate, just for how that was covered and how that was perceived. But the fact, what he did here, his kind of direct involvement, sending Chenot in there to stop that peace deal for just that one time, Nixon coming in trying to act like, hey, I could better get it, come in, get a better deal here. That was just where some of the worst brutalities of the Vietnam War happened. Just the use of aggressive bombing campaign, use of chemical weapons, all that kind of just horrific stuff. And all that was just completely, it could have been completely unnecessary if Chanel just hadn't got there. Chiu hadn't stalled the peace talks, all that kind of thing. And the incredible impact that it had on, the war, our culture, and, the country of Vietnam for many, many years to come, I think cannot be overlooked. And I think, without a doubt, the true worst crime of the Nixon administration, in which, like most presidential administrations, there were numerous. All right. Hidden History returns again on Tuesday. Thanks so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show.